laiks mūsu šīs konferences galvenai viešņai. Mums liels prieks, ka viņas pieredze un zināšanas noteikti bagātinās arī ikvienu no mums. Viņa ir godalgota sociālā uzņēmēja, daudz nozaru māksliniece un neatkarīga konsultante. Konsultē uzņēmumus visā pasaulē klimata, ilgtspējas, iekļaušanas un sociālās ietekmes jautājumos. Living Institute, un viņa ir tur galvenā konsultante. Sagaidām ar aplausiem Veronica D'Souza. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Hi everyone, I'm Veronica and I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's my first time in Riga and so far I've been treated like a princess. So I just want to say thank you also for inviting me to listen in on this day of celebration. Because it's a day of achievement, and hearing how you've managed to make both the public and the private sector come together around this agenda is impressive, it's progressive, and so it's an honor, and I look forward to learning a lot from you today. So I would like to share a little bit with you just about Living Institute, what we do, and a little bit about my personal story, and maybe also just dive into the whole concept of why is this important and how do we actually work with this around the world? Because as was mentioned today, it's gaining more and more traction. It's becoming popular, which is cool. So you don't have to fight against the rules all the time to say this is important. But one thing is creating alignment about that it's important. Another thing is making it work. And there are some do's and don'ts, at least, that we experience about that. So that's my intention for today. And just briefly, Living Institute is a consultancy has headquarters in Copenhagen, but we work 70% around the world with some of the world's largest companies. And we've been doing this for more than 20 years. It started with, cultural diversity, cultural intelligence, gender, etc., and then elaborated. So it's something that we've been doing with a lot of different companies, a lot of different public organizations for a very long time. And what we feel and what we see now is it's really catching up. So the agendas are changing and the depth of the work is changing, which is fantastic. One of the secret sauces and key ingredients of what we try to do is to not show that we actually are academics. Because very often it doesn't work when you talk about a lot of academic knowledge, but it works when you do exercises and when you put it into practical and people feel what is happening when you're included, when you're excluded. So a lot of the work that we do is around making it practical and making it felt so that everyone can resonate as a human being. And so that's the most important thing. So I'm also going to ask you to do a little bit of interaction, if that's okay. I would just like to share with you a little bit of background about myself and my personal story. My hope is that it creates a space of safety, that I share a little bit about who I am, but also gives you some insights to why I'm personally so motivated about this agenda. So is everyone okay also with the tempo and English and sound? Is there, yeah, good. Otherwise you let me know. So I grew up in Denmark. I'm half Danish, half Indian. My Indian father grew up in Tanzania, in East Africa, born in Iran. So a little bit from all over. And I would say that we had inclusion practice for breakfast, lunch, and dinner when I grew up. Because when you grow up in I grew up in a small town south of Aarhus in Denmark, which is a fairly homogenic place. There was a lot of explanation. There was a lot of understanding and a lot of sensitivation and a lot of positive questions also. But you couldn't actually escape having to create a language, right? That was part of creating belonging. And my father was a musician. I also do a lot of music, but he was a musician, and he used music to create cultural awareness by employing musicians who were having basically cleaner jobs, giving them a pedagogical education, and using these incredible musicians from all over the world to educate children in Denmark about world culture. So my house was full of world musicians, you can imagine, who came and with all different types of energies. And then it was also a very classic Danish white town. So it was this meeting, which was a lot of fun. And I think that gave me both the cultural appetite and the excitement. And I could see from a child how similar we are as human beings. As soon as you create some kind of frequency of understanding and empathy, you can connect with almost anyone. Then it stops being a barrier. And if you create that safety, as was discussed before, everyone feels that you can be yourself. And the value of that means that we increase the competence, the capability in the room. And that's the whole point. That's why we're doing this. That's why we're talking about this. Because we all have so much to offer. And creating those spaces. I then went to business school because I felt that business in many ways has a lot of power in the world, economics, and I think it's interesting to understand if you want to change the world. I've always been passionate about change. How can you work with power? How can you infiltrate that? Who makes decisions? And I've spent most of my career creating businesses that improves societal conditions for people, for marginalized people. That's basically been my core, and I think that's because when you've tried to be a minority, not necessarily in a bad way, but when you have, you always notice who is not in the room. It's just a given. When you're not the majority, you just always see. You just detect it. Who is here, who isn't here? And that in many ways is a gift, because you can use that as a bridge. So the first company I started was in East Africa. I worked with young girls who cannot afford menstrual hygiene products. So they stay home from school, and it's the main reason why they drop out of school is lack of menstrual hygiene products. So we took a menstrual cup, I don't know if everyone knows what it is, but it's like a silicone cup that is reusable, and introduced that, and through inclusive business practices. So inclusivity is also, as you all probably know, it's a strategy for how you build a business. It's not just a strategy for how you build your team, but it's also how do you work with people? How do you come to good results? And inclusive business practices, very much based on like an anthropological approach. So instead of coming with a solution, you come with a question. You come with a way of creating safety in a space for people to open up. And we did that, and I lived in Nairobi for 3 years and developed that business with young girls, with 13-year-old young girls, because they knew what they needed. They knew what the product should look like. They knew how to make it, how they want, for them to want to use it. So inclusivity is also, for me, a very fundamental approach to creating value for customers and understanding that you're delivering something that will succeed. Now, I'll jump further on, but the second company that I built was a fashion company that we set up productions inside of women's prisons in Thailand and Peru. Because the main cause of female incarceration in the world is poverty. It's women who come from rural communities with low levels of education who are mothers and who end up committing crimes, drug trafficking, prostitution, etc. So they end up in prison and have to give up their children. And we set up living wages, saving accounts, and education and skills training so they could keep on providing for their children and save up for when they get out. Again, trying to build something that didn't necessarily exist, was relying on inclusion not just of women who were excluded in general, but also on the knowledge and the capacity, because I had no clue how to build a fair workplace in a prison. There is no recipe for that. No one can tell you. So they had to educate me. What I could do was to ask questions and create a safe space and create trust. And with that, we could start developing and build new things. And I know not everyone here is working to do something in marginalized communities, but I think everyone is trying to create value and is trying to work to create new knowledge in teams where you can think about how do we make sure that everyone's perspectives are being brought to the circus. This also goes for your customers. So I won't dive more into that, but I just wanted to share with you that this is one of the key motivations for me of understanding how diversity, equity, and inclusion is not just the right thing to do and nice, but it's fundamental if we want to unlock the solutions that we need for building the world that we need. And I don't think there's any disagreement anywhere in the world, actually, that some of the world systems we have in place right now maybe have served their due. We have a lot of different crises that we will all have to navigate in, and we will have to rethink and come up with new ways of creating value, new ways of creating culture. And this is our time to do that. And we can only do that if we unlock all the talent and all the voices that might have ideas. So, does it shift? No? Now it does. Good. So what I'm talking about really is something at least we talk about as diversity intelligence, right? It's how do you make it? How do you make a culture that thrives off all these different inputs, of ideas you would never have gotten, or ways of looking at things that you didn't think about? I mean, if you had all the answers anyways, then you wouldn't need anyone else. So it's really about that. And our definition of that is to say, well, it's creating amazing results with people who are different than you. And some might think, and I don't think it's in this room, this is a special room where everyone is already carrying the flag. Not all rooms are like that, and I think you also know. But some people think, oh, this sounds horrible. Why do I have to work with people who are so different than me? It's not so easy, right? It's much easier to hang out with people who are similar. We are an animal. We like being around people who are like us. That's human nature. So why is it that we have to work with people who are different, and why should that be great for us? Well, one of the answers, at least, it's not the only one, we heard it in the opening speech, could come from Goldman Sachs. And in 2020, Goldman Sachs made a decision to say that they no longer list companies that don't have at least 2 women on the board. Currently, at that time, that was 5% of the top companies. Why did they do that? You know? Does anyone have a suggestion? No? I mean, Goldman Sachs, without knowing exactly how their leadership team, it definitely doesn't look like this, like this room. So, Goldman Sachs is not famous for being motivated by doing the right thing or necessarily just wanting everyone to, I mean, they probably also want that, but they're motivated by creating the highest possible return, right, for their clients. That's what they need to do, that's their task. And their decision to do this moved the landscape for many companies to say, well, now it's not just a question on whether or we should have diversity, it is how and how fast. And that's what we're experiencing as a consultancy. When companies come to us, Google, the likes, large companies, Novo Nordisk, they don't say, we're thinking about whether we should have more diversity. We're like, how fast can we do this? Because they're competing for talent. And just as you heard in the opening speech, the largest companies are aware that this is a fight for talent and it's a fight for innovation. one of the arguments for Goldman Sachs could be found in this study. This is made back in 2011 by MIT, by Professors William Malone. And what this study shows, they investigated the intelligence, basically, did intelligence tests on 192 different teams. And what this study shows is that when you compare teams where individual IQ and the team IQ, right? So they measured the intelligence test of the individuals and the teams. And the teams with more women, just as one factor of diversity, collectively performed higher as a collective intelligence than the teams where all individuals had a higher IQ. So what this really shows is that when you have diversity and you understand how to include diversity, and I'll get into that a little bit later on, the collective intelligence increases. So basically, we're stronger as a collective if we're different. Now, if we know this, why doesn't all company leadership rooms look like this room? This is very rare that I go to see, a company leadership room and it looks like this. I know it's not one company, but just to say, if I go to talk with the sustainability team, the marketing team, the HR team, the representation can look somewhat like this. But when it comes to senior leadership in a lot of different industries, it very rarely does, to be honest. And I don't know how that is here. If all of the rooms that you are in normally, do they all look like this? No. Okay. So one of the questions that we asked the finance sector, different sectors, was, if we know this, what's the barriers? Like, for example, and now we're just talking about gender as one aspect of diversity, but what are the barriers? Could it be that we just don't have enough female talent? And I would be curious to see how this room responds, but I wonder, within your organization, if you were to just speak for 2 minutes or 1 minute with the person next to you, just share. Do you believe you have enough, for now we call it, let's say, female talent? Curious how this room responds, but do you have enough female talent, you think, to create gender equality, let's just say, in the top leadership? Maybe just share with your partner just for a minute. Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay. Thank you. All right. Just to see a raise of hands. I mean, we can't go into like a full workshop mode, and I know this is a special room. So I'm curious to hear. Just out of this room, just raise your hand. For the organizations that you work in, how many here believe that there is enough female talent in the organization to create gender equality in your leadership team? Just raise your hand if you think that there is. Okay. The majority. I'm not surprised when it comes to this room. Well, how many do not think that you have enough yet female talent? No one is. Okay, a few. Good. Good. So there is no right or wrong. This is not a moral exercise. But we asked this question to the Danish finance industry and a lot of different industries, and the answers changed, or they differed. So the male top leaders responded. 20% said, we have enough female talent to create gender equality in the leadership team. The female respondents said 60%. Now, what does this show us? I mean, you could argue, right, that either you have the talent or you don't, right? The discrepancy is so big that it cannot only be counted for how you perceive value. It has to do with what we also call availability bias. And again, this is a human perception. So there is not, when we talk about this agenda, I'm just using gender now, and I think that's an easy one here because there's an overrepresentation of women. Normally it's the other way around, so I hope everyone feels comfortable with this. But really, it's just showing us that we tend to see things as we're used to seeing them, right? So the most typical, the most visible, is what we think about. And for example, we tend to think that it might be more possible to have a flight crash than a car crash. We overestimate, shark attacks, but drowning is much more plausible than shark attacks. And it has to do with what we see and what we experience. If we see male leaders everywhere, we will somehow, in our brain, map that this is what a leader is supposed to look like. So representation is not all we need to do, but it actually really matters. It matters for the patterns in the brain of what we see. It matters to be exposed. It's not enough to be aware. It's how we build out these different lanes in our brain of what we find normal, natural, powerful, cool, strong leadership, all these different attributes, cognitive attributes. How do we connect them? Another little image here. I'm just going to move this chair a bit back. So, I wish I had a picture of this room on the screen, but anyways, now we have a picture of this room. I love the contrast. So, another maybe possible explanation for why, when we know, that diversity really increases the collective intelligence and performance, why don't we have more of it? Maybe this could be one of the answers. Can you see, are there any women in the picture? Yes? Okay. How many? 3, 4? It's hard to tell, right? 4? There are 5. Good. But it's not so easy to see them. Can we agree on that? So this is another type of bias. It's called conformity bias. It's also called covering. Have any of you ever tried to cover? Okay, I have. Covering is when you feel that there is a dominant culture that has value, and you feel that if you want to participate in that, you will try to do the same, right? Because you might fear, the women here might fear that if they were looking differently, that they might not be perceived as serious or as good as the men, right? So what do? You dress up as how value is perceived. Now, one of the problems in that is, of course, that you don't really reap all the, it's not about the dress code, but this an image. It's about creating a space where if you feel there's a certain way you have to behave or talk, you will not bring out all your different aspects and what makes you unique. You will tend to conform. And then we won't have all the benefits of diversity. So even though representation matters, representation is not enough. And I think that's where right now we are. If you look at the overall trends, there's been a focus on representation, but without inclusion, you don't necessarily get the benefits of representation. And I'll elaborate a little bit on that. So bias. Does anyone know why we have bias? Well, it's also a rhetorical question. It's because we have a brain. So if we have a brain, we have bias. We can't help it. And I think that's very important when you work with your colleagues in your workplace to destigmatize bias. Bias is seen a little bit like, if you're supposed to not have it. If you are supposed to be working for equality. No one wants to have bias, right? But we all do. So maybe a language around that is just to clarify that and start with saying, if you have a brain, you have bias, because then we are all in this together. And we all have to acknowledge that, and we all have to work on that. It would be impossible not to have bias. That doesn't mean you can't change them or become aware of them. But if you start from that point of departure, you also create an equal playing field where no one feels left out or wrong or not included, which can also happen in this agenda. Now, 2% of all of our thinking is made in the conscious part of the brain, which means 98% of our thinking is made in the unconscious part of the brain. So that's why when we work, we do normally a lot of practical exercises, because it's not enough to become aware and know it. We have to feel it, sense it, train it, experience it. Then we can start creating new patterns. We can start becoming more exposed. That's really where the behavior change comes in. On an average, let's just see here. Yeah, we have like 11 million stimuli per day in the unconscious and 40 in the conscious. So this says a little bit about also becoming aware of being open. Is it? Yeah, okay. This is a beautiful place, by the way. Such a beautiful space. Now, I talked a little bit about gender, and I think in this room you're all experts, so I don't need to dive too much into all the different aspects of diversity. But of course, we have the visible aspects, the socioeconomic, religion, disability, gender, ethnicity, age, nationality, sexual orientation, right? These are just some of the different, more visible varieties that we have a little bit of language for. However, when we talk about the unconscious and the power of that, we also have the cognitive diversity. And that's very important to remember. Talents, personality, neurodiversity, beliefs and values, education, and experiences. So when we talk about diversity, we're talking about how can we create a space where you get to bring all of that, all of who you are, instead of being, I'm a woman, I have a business degree, I'm also a musician, okay, but I'm also so many more things. And I guess, in the perfect utopian world, when we have arrived to this equitable space where we all get to be everything we are, we hopefully wouldn't matter, right? So we hopefully will get beyond language. We are not there. We need language for now. But hopefully we'll get to a place where we don't have to choose, or we don't have to say, or we don't have to fit into any type of box. You don't have to identify as a white heterosexual man, or, it's limiting for all of us to be in these boxes. But I think the most important part is, when we talk about diversity, we need to look for the things we can't necessarily see. We need to make space. You might have a group that might look homogeneous. Like, I could say this room could look in some aspects homogeneous, at least when it comes to gender. I am aware of the men that are here, it's not that, but it's a majority, a different majority. If I look overall, there's kind of maybe some kind of, ethnic homogeneity, more of all. I don't know, but when you go under the surface, I'm pretty sure we have a very diverse group of talents, of education, of background, of a lot of different things, belief systems, personalities. So when you look at your teams, there might be a way to look at diversity, to unlock and to be curious about not just the things we can see, but all the things we can't see. Because that's also where a lot of the gifts are when we're talking about the collective intelligence. Now, when we're talking about homogeneous and diverse teams, we have quite a lot of studies showing us, and maybe you know this feeling, that if you work with a homogeneous team, it can be really easy to get started. It's nice. It's like, okay, pick, if you're getting a task and you're like, pick your team, you're gonna pick people that you work really well with, right? That makes sense. And it's so nice, do you know that feeling when you sit down and you're like, how should we do this? And you really quickly come to a way of working. And you're like, yes, this is great, because we're so aligned. And you just get to do it, and people are chipping in, and the collaboration works so well. And you're like, this is getting us to a good result. And you had a great process, and you deliver a good result. Can you recognize the great feeling in that? Okay, so this is normally what it means to work in a homogeneous team. So if you can recognize that, you might also look at that team and think, how alike are we? Are we actually that diverse? When you look at diverse teams, they struggle much more in the beginning. What, you want to do it that way? Oh no, I don't know, that doesn't make any sense to me. You want to talk for like 5 hours before we start working? I think we should start working first. You'll have all of these complicated, annoying, frustrating moments before you even get started. And it might feel inefficient. It might feel like a waste of time. It might feel sometimes that you even think the other person is a little bit unintelligent. So we tend to want to not do that. But that actually means you're working with someone who's different from you. What it also shows is when you do that and you actually make it work, you perform much higher. It takes longer time, and you don't get there in the beginning, but when you do, you get a higher performance. That's the benefit of diversity. But you only do that with the special ingredient called inclusion. And in all of this, in everything we're talking about, if there's just one thing that you should remember or take with you, at least that I would like to leave you with, it's inclusion is key. Without inclusion, diversity is an exercise. And it becomes a little bit like the room with all the men in the picture where everyone else is covering, And it can look different, and you might wear different colors, but really, culturally, you'll have the same kind of output. And you'll end up where the homogeneous teams are. Or even worse, without inclusion, what we see is actually that diverse teams perform worse. What happens is that either people conform, as we talked about before, or they leave. Because you end up creating a space where you cannot bring your full self. So diversity without inclusion is a very bad idea. So if you're in a company, if you're in I don't think any of you are, since you're here today for this celebration, but without inclusion, we see teams, companies failing, losing talent, not performing, being unsatisfied. So, I just wanted to leave that with you. And yeah, of course that's related to the unconscious bias that we talked about. Now, when we look at the world, what is important when you have, homogeneous teams used to work really well. And they can work really well. And for really short assignments where you need to get to a good result really quickly, they can work. So also just to say, there are times and times for different types of leadership, for different types of teams. But when you look at the world and the complexity, it has increased. So if you're working on complex innovation, long-term strategies, big things, and most companies in the world of today, which is globalized, which is intersectional issues with sustainability, business is changing all the time. Everything is becoming more complex. So in order to unlock talent, you need to unlock the thinking of diversity. Otherwise, you might end up with this knowledge clustering, that you just all kind of agree on the same thing, but you don't have that innovative thinking. So I'll skip the discussion for now, but I just want to spend a few minutes on talking about how we work with this. We work with a lot of different companies who might have done a lot of work on this for 20 years. When it comes to gender, diversity is expanding as a field, but most companies we work with, it's not like they just started yesterday. They've had a lot of different work going on, but a lot of them come to us because they say, it hasn't actually, we're not there, We need to do something else. And what we've found is that if you work in a certain way, you can turn what can be seen as a marathon into a sprint. So I'm just going to give you not the all full depth of it, but just a few highlights for you to take away of at least what we experience works. So we look at things that are easy to implement and that have a high effect. And one of the things that are, top of that is inclusion surveys. Get a real understanding of how people in your organization see this. And really what we look for there is the people who are not feeling included. What is it that they're saying? What is that? What are those little signals that we need to pick up on? Synchronizing top management and anchoring DEI at the top, it's basically one of the most fundamental things. And you probably all know that in your organizations. That's why you're sitting here. I would guess that that's what part of the success for you doing this work is that. We really see a huge difference. If it's the HR team or sustainability or anyone else who's leading this and it's not anchored at the top, it's very difficult to see real results. So if there's one thing, it is really to make sure that it's a strategic conversation, and we do that a lot with top management. Why do you want to do this? Why is it important for you? And again, well, it's the right thing to do. Yeah, but why is it business relevant? What is it you want to achieve? And how are we going to look back and how are we going to measure on that? So if you anchor it like that, then we see huge results. We educate champions, of course, who basically are aligned and who are there to carry through. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'll just skip some of them. But an important one, and I think this is something interesting, is mobilizing men. We sometimes say, and again, not in a room like this, but we sometimes say that the women should go home and eat popcorn. A little bit as a joke, but because when we see men taking ownership of this agenda in the organizations, things change. And there has been a tendency to fix the women, to say, oh, it's the women who need to be more trained in asking for a higher pay, or the women need to learn leadership training, or etc. So what we've also seen, sorry, I'm just skipping a little bit to this. Good. This is a little bit of a slow, bear with me. Slow clear. So yeah, you can see where I place them. Of course, I'm not going to run. They will be very boring for you if I had to run through all of this right now. But what I want to tell you is there is a roadmap, and there are things that work and things that are not as successful. So when you see a lot of companies doing only women networks, for example, that's one of the things we see do not have an effect at all. What happens is that women speak to each other and they find out that it's not them, it's the culture, and then they leave. Or they stay, but they're super unsatisfied, and the main culture remains the same. So this is not it's not on the gender, or it's not on the minority, right? It's on the culture and on the structures. And so this also goes with the opposite. I mean, if it's an all women, we just talk about men now because that's how it normally looks like, but this could also be with the opposite majority. So don't leave it on minorities to create change. Incentivize the majority. Create language around that, because that's what's going to move the needle. Good. So this is a little bit, I've made a little bit, tapped into a little bit of all the different aspects and all the different work we're doing. What we see right now is what people and companies are really interested in is inclusive leadership. Is how do you lead a company based on these different elements? How do you integrate that? And that, of course, taps into unconscious bias training. It taps into cultural intelligence. It taps into DEI champions, masterclasses, all these different aspects. And we work with companies across the world to do that. Now, my time is running up. I could spend much more time with you, but I just want to leave you with a few takeaways. First of all the research shows that diversity is good for business and organizations. If inclusion is not there, it's not. So work on inclusion and a culture of inclusion. That's the fundamental aspect of making diversity. But if you do, then it is. That's one point. And look at the talents, because it's really about that. How do you look for diversity in yourself, but also in your colleagues? And how do you move maybe down to the things that are not so visible, beyond gender and race, sexuality, etc.? Do you have champions in your organization? And then work strategically. And again, I look forward to staying here the rest of the day because I look forward to you teaching me everything that you have learned on the journey that you're on. I think it's incredible to see a room like this. I think it's incredible what the Society Integration Foundation is doing. And I'm really, really honored to be here with you today. And I look forward to celebrating everything and all the progress you've been doing. Congratulations. I hope you all have a very great journey in creating equitable futures for everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.